A new report from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has come up with some interesting findings on the physical, social, and economic impacts of the COVID lockdowns. So joining us from Calgary to chat about this study, which is entitled 5 Years On, Tracing the Costs of Lockdowns. Well, here's Benjamin Klassen. He's the Research and Education Coordinator with the Justice Center. Welcome, Benjamin. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so Benjamin, COVID restrictions, they started back in 2020, in theory, to protect the health of Canadians. But did the lockdowns help or hinder people's overall health? What did the report have to say on the mental and emotional health of Canadians about this?
Yeah, that's exactly what we were trying to find out in this report. And we looked at a whole series of data, cataloging data over year over year over the last 5 years. And we found that COVID in reality caused more harms than actually contributed to saving lives.
Yeah, of course, elderly people are more vulnerable to things like the flu or COVID. So many did feel that the restrictions and lockdowns were justified, of course. But with the loneliness and the lack of emotional support available, do we know to what degree this actually affected the mental health and also physical health of seniors?
We didn't look at the mental health and physical health at seniors in detail that much. We looked more at Canadians overall and also younger people. But what we do know is that even for seniors, there were lots of deaths that were not caused by COVID, and this was way more pronounced for younger Canadians. So, for example, Canadians under the age of 45 had very low COVID death rates, but had quite high non-COVID death rates.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when we're talking about loneliness, lack of emotional support and all of that, it can apply to any age, obviously. We saw what happened with the kids, with the school lockdowns and whatnot, right? The depression seemed to be on the rise.
Yeah, that's right. Mental health was something that was overlooked largely by politicians and policymakers. What we found in this report is that Canadians' overall mental health dropped dramatically, and that was for all ages. But most pronounced again was for young Canadians, especially the Canadians under the age of 45. Kids too were very affected. Not being able to go to school and socialize in person, not being able to engage in physical activity as much, and also spending lots of time on screens. And so all that contributed significantly to a downward spiral in their mental health. And one report actually cited that there was around 67 to 70% of children that had a deterioration in at least one area of mental health. So, for example, depression, anxiety, and other obsessive.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, OCD, you were saying, like obsessive compulsive disorder. I could see that happening. Absolutely. It was just unbelievable what these kids went through. Is there any evidence that the lockdowns contributed to an increase in suicides?
Yeah, so that's a good question because suicide was okay. I'm talking about medical assistance in suicide was
Okay.
legalized in 2016. And so since 2016, we see a continuing trend, upward trend in suicides, assisted suicides. But that trend increased even more in 2021. By 2023, we saw more than 15,000 Canadians choosing to die at the hands of doctors. And so that was about 5% of all Canadian deaths. And it was over 600 of those deaths that were with Canadians that did not have natural death reasonably foreseeable in the near future, and so that meant that it was Canadians with some sort of mental health issues. In terms of suicide overall, we didn't look at that very specifically, but those results were more mixed.
Oh my goodness. And of course, one of the problems during COVID was that thousands of medical checkups, diagnoses, treatments were delayed or canceled. And of course, that results in a serious ongoing backlog in Canada's healthcare system, doesn't it? So the question is, I guess, did efforts to stop the spread of COVID inadvertently cause more sickness and deaths that would have happened without the lockdowns?
Yes, that's absolutely true. During COVID, many thousands, I think it was over 15,000 MRI scans that were canceled, as well as a similar amount of cancer surgeries, non-urgent cancer surgeries that were canceled. And so that resulted in delays of diagnoses of cancers and various other illnesses. And it also resulted in cancer cases being more progressed already. And so there was a study that came out in the UK that listed all the number of excess deaths in various cancer categories. So, for example, lung cancers, prostate cancers, and so on. They all saw cancer cases above like 2 to 3,000 number of deaths in those cases in a year. So,
That
yeah.
is scary. I mean, when you mention, cancer surgery, I think any surgery for cancer should be an important one, should be right at the top of the list, not one that can be left for months and years. That's so scary. So, Benjamin, what was the economic impact of the lockdowns? We talked about healthcare there, but economically, how many businesses went under? How many people ended up unemployed?
Yeah, that is interesting because we looked at how many businesses went under. Or insolvencies as they call it.
Mhm.
And ironically, during 2020, we saw a notable dip in the number of bankruptcies in businesses, but that was likely due to government subsidies for these businesses, including restaurants. There was less bankruptcies in 2020 than in the following years, or even in the preceding years. And again, that is likely because of government subsidies. But we are now seeing, as expected, we are now seeing those bankruptcies, the number of bankruptcies arise. And so, for example, in 2024, we had a higher number of bankruptcies and insolvencies than in the previous 5 years before COVID.
That's interesting. Do you think there's a relationship between the two? Do you think that maybe they were trying to get through those times and then they've kind of just gotten to that point where it's like, this is how it is, and we give up?
Yeah, so again, the dip in insolvencies could be largely due to government subsidies, but another thing would be businesses taking on loans during those years. And so now that those loans are maturing with higher interest rates, as we are seeing now, it all has a ripple effect. And this is something that governments, I don't think, looked at and considered enough. And you were also mentioning of other economic harms, and one of the economic harms that we saw, of course, in 2020 was a considerable spike in the number of unemployment rates. And so what we noticed was that those people that were affected by unemployment, they were almost entirely people that were being paid like minimum wage or so on. But the laptop class, those that get higher wages, they were almost entirely unaffected. In fact, we saw an increase in employment rates for in that category.
All right. Can it be proven that the increase in food prices, housing, and other essentials was also due to the lockdowns?
Yeah, so it is hard, as we point out in the report, it is hard to actually prove a causality or a causal relationship between lockdowns and many of these harms. But we do point out that a lot of these harms were, of course, very likely due to lockdowns. And so during COVID, governments took on an extraordinary amount of debt. I believe it was over 650 billion in total debt that federal and provincial governments took on over these years. And so that, of course, had a negative impact on prices, more money chasing fewer goods. And so, especially housing and food prices were especially affected with prices rising in 2022, 2023, and 2024 by 15, 17, 18%. And yeah.
Wow. This is an interesting one. The report also shows that there was an increase seen in crime rates.
Yeah, we saw an increase in homicides, a notable increase in homicides, but the most pronounced increase in crime rates was actually cybercrime. So, for example, cyber fraud increased by I can't quite remember the number, but I think it doubled, more than doubled. We saw a huge spike in online child sexual exploitation, whether it was luring, whether it was pre- posting child pornography, and so on. And yeah, with online fraud, other types of online fraud, people are at risk of having their of identity theft, and with that comes financial loss and all sorts of other difficulties.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. Also, I believe domestic crime went up. People are kind of stuck under the house together for so long. It's interesting because there were other studies done that showed a decrease in crime rates due to the lockdown, specifically one by the Fraser Institute called Comparing Recent Crime Trends Between Canada and the U.S. They sort of looked at that and saw that crime rates went down, I think mostly because people are at home. But like you said, it just depends on the type of crime.
That is very true. I did look at that as well, domestic crime. And ironically, domestic crime victims increased a little bit for male victims, but not so much for female victims. And so the results were mixed in that regard, and we decided not to include that. But there are, however, in those kinds of statistics, many things that we don't see. Yeah, so for example, the statistics showed that there was a decrease in overall alcohol consumption. But when you interviewed Canadians, they said that they consumed way more alcohol now, especially at home. And so what might explain that was Canadians were no longer able to go to pubs, for example, and have regular drinks with their friends there. So the overall decrease in Canadians' alcohol consumption was kind of explained away by that, but that didn't mean that they were not consuming more alcohol at home. And so, like when talking about statistics, there are a lot of different things that come into play, and yeah, so there were some mixed results there.
Okay, I can see that happening. One of the biggest grievances many Canadians had, obviously, was the loss of personal freedoms, including being able to speak freely, assemble freely, travel freely, worship freely, and not only that, but the enforcement of this through fines and imprisonment and the freezing of financial assets.
Yeah, that's right, and that's exactly why we wanted to produce a report that measured the lockdown harms on Canadians. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms should only be restricted, or any rights and freedoms can only be restricted if such restrictions are legitimately justified or demonstrably justified. And during COVID, governments oftentimes acted on assumptions and believed news reports and predictions that tens of thousands of Canadians were going to die based, of COVID, and so they went into lockdowns and did not consider, in our view, enough the lockdown harms that were going to result, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And so that's what this report is really trying to get at, is trying to reveal the true costs of these lockdown harms, to show that the lockdowns were really not demonstrably justified.
Your report is calling for governments to take responsibility for the damage done during this period and ensure that future public health policies uphold the Charter rights and freedoms of all Canadians. So what would this taking responsibility actually look like, practically speaking? Should some type of restitution be made? Should some laws be changed? Do you think we'll see any government accountability at some point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess there's a lot of things that they could do, but I think to start would be, hey, we made some mistakes. The data showed that the lockdowns did actually not contribute to more benefits than the actual harms did. And so in the future, we need to be more careful about the kinds of policies that we put in place, especially when they affect Canadians' rights and freedoms.
Benjamin, thanks so much for being with us today. I appreciate having you on.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Benjamin Klassen is the Research and Education Coordinator with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.